So I'm really excited to talk to you, and I want to kind of give some background for the people who are watching this. Like, we actually don't really work together that often. I've talked to you maybe a handful of times. Mostly I appreciate that you and I are both from Michigan. And so we can talk about like Michigan things. Oh, you didn't remember. How embarrassing for you on this panel that will be watched by all these people.
Terrible.
So yeah, so anyway, you have been doing Frazz for a while, and I'm not your regular editor, so I think maybe some background is like there are many editors at a syndicate, and so every cartoonist works with maybe a different editor. The other two panels that I've done for NCS Fest are people that I do work with, and so that's a little bit of a different relationship as far as my insight into their process. So I will be coming at this, like, this will be a mystery to me as well. So when I ask you questions, I won't know the answers when I ask them. So like, talk a little bit about like, what's your cartoon about, and how did you come up with the idea for it?
Okay, we can do that. Yeah, Frazz has been going on a while. We hit 20 years back in April. So that's still kind of astonishing to me too. It always has felt from the beginning like I was getting away with something. This is really a dream job. And back when it was still just a dream instead of a dream job, it kind of came up, go back to before I was doing the strip, and I had written and illustrated a children's book back in the 90s. And when you do that, you spend a lot of time at elementary schools, reading the book, doing assemblies, drawing for kids. And it was at those assemblies that I noticed a pretty interesting pattern. For anyone who doesn't know, Frazz is the title character in the strip, and he is a janitor in an elementary school. So I'm at elementary schools, among other schools, but in this case, at elementary schools doing assemblies. And I noticed a pattern really quickly that when, when students are waiting for an assembly to start, that's like the next best thing to recess, right? Or even better, because it's the last thing before you go home. A lot of times it's the last thing of the day. And so the kids are all riled up, and some poor teacher goes into the gym or the auditorium or the assembly hall to calm them down a little bit before I get them riled up again. And it usually doesn't work. You know, the kids, they're enthusiastic, they're excited, they're kids. And so teacher couldn't get them to calm down. Principal may come out, can't necessarily get the kids to calm down. The janitor would come out, and he or she wouldn't really even have to do anything. The kids would calm down. It's not that they were afraid of the janitor. The janitor was just one of them. You know, it was kind of an adult, but also kind of a kid too, and crossed the line in a certain way. And the kids could relate to the janitor. And this was at school after school after school. And I just kind of filed that away. This is still some years before I started doing Frazz. And I filed it away, and I thought, wow, this could be a good book or a story or a comic strip someday. And fast forward a few years, I was working as an art director at a news bureau for a chain of newspapers then. And as I was seeing the bureau, you know, the business model was looking like that particular bureau might dissolve. And I thought, okay, probably time to go back to college, finish my degree, and get serious about this stuff. But first, let's try the comic strip idea. I had drawn a comic strip when I was in high school and college age, and that stayed with me, but I went and did other things for a living for a while. And so I thought, well, let's do this. Let's try one more shot at it, mostly because I didn't want to turn 70 years old and wonder what if. Well, now I know what if, but I had to come up with a premise. And that's when my brain went straight back to the janitors in the elementary school. And just a few sketches and a few storylines later, I didn't even come up with a plan B. That was it. All I could think of was, why didn't somebody come up with this earlier? And I worked it through, and we have Frazz. And I think I think people did come up with it earlier. They just put it in movies, you know, like The Breakfast Club had a janitor in a pretty key role. And but not really so much with the comic strip in the main role. And
yeah, I think that main role
worked.
thing is the key. Yeah.
It just worked.
I really enjoy hearing that story because when I look at Frazz and when I read Frazz, I do remember as a child in schools, like the janitor was always cool and everybody always knew them because you have different teachers, you know, you have different teachers and you're in different classes throughout the school year, but generally the janitor is the same person. And so you get to know that person and like, yeah, they don't get mad at you for stuff. Like maybe they tell you to pick stuff up, but there is that weird, like you're saying, like that hybrid role of like authority figure, but also like a normal person that you can kind of talk to as a kid. So I think that having that as the focal point for Frazz makes so much sense. And it is shocking to me that hasn't been pulled out more in storytelling, just because there are very few people in children's lives who occupy that space.
And everybody has a favorite janitor from when they were in school.
Yeah.
And yeah, the janitor is in an interesting spot too, because the janitor gets to see, I won't say the worst side of kids, but sometimes the more embarrassing side of kids. You know, a kid has an accident, the kid throws up at school. It's the janitor that says, it's okay, I got this, you know, or even worse, you know, you drop your lunch tray in front of the whole cafeteria. That's even more embarrassing. And the janitor helps clean it up. And yeah, he's the guy or she's the guy who can say, it's okay, it happens to everybody. I got this. And it's a neat personality.
Yeah, and it's also definitely something that carries through in the storytelling that you do in Frazz, because you have this very compassionate world. Like you have children who are trying to reckon with stuff that's happening outside the school, and then you have this an adult person who can kind of give a little bit of context to them while also being very relatable. And I think for the audience, I think that your audience is probably like everybody, because it's newspapers, and so like obviously children are not necessarily buying newspapers, though I don't know why not. They're I'm not getting into my series of jokes about that, but I think that it is a thing that adults and children can really relate to and also connect with. So I'm sorry, Jason, there's a dog barking in the background. I cannot stop it. It's not my dog. Like I could if it was my dog. Jef, what's your favorite thing about reading comics? I'm just gonna close this window real fast. So please talk, yeah, and I will do this thing.
My favorite thing about reading comics is that they're fun. I mean, who doesn't like to have fun? And they're instant fun. I mean, either you read a strip and either it works or it doesn't that day. And whether it works or it doesn't, you move on to the next one. You know, because whether it's GoComics or a comics page, there's a next one. And you just bing, 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 you get that reward, you get that dopamine rush, you get that little thing that you learned that you didn't know, that new different way of looking at something. It's so quick, which doesn't mean it's superficial. Sometimes it is, but doesn't mean it's superficial. It's just so quick and so reliable. You know, you can count on it coming back the next day and there it is again. I love the consistency of it, but it can be anything, but it's almost always fun. And I like that. The comics have always been fun for me to read. As a kid, which maybe I didn't buy the papers when I was a kid, but I certainly read the newspapers that other people bought, whether they were at home. We were definitely a multiple newspaper family, or at school, school library, everywhere. I was always a newspaper reader and always a comics reader.
Yeah, I have distinct memories of waiting for my parents to be done with the section of the paper that had the comics, because I wanted to read the comics. And so that's definitely that very foundational memory that now that things are so digital, I don't know how, like, I want to know what people like 10, 20 years from now are like, I remember this process, or like, I remember waiting in this way, or like, I always feel like so many foundational memories are like, there's a tension, like there's something that you're waiting to do and you can't do it immediately. And I know that still exists, but I'm so removed from it now because I have cats, not children, and I am old. So But I'm always, I like that comics are still so much a part of it. And so like comics like Frazz, which are geared toward a younger audience. Like I'm always really happy that that connection between comic strips and children is so strong and remains so strong. Because, you know, like that's one of the ways that I started reading. And I think that that's one of the ways that people continue to learn how to read.
When you were a kid, did you have brothers and sisters?
Yeah, I had a little brother.
So did you take did you have the Sunday comics routine where, you know, it's in multiple sections because it's a big comics section back then. And, you know, well, it's your turn to read this page and their turn to read that page. The passing around of the comics was just great.
In my case, like he's 6 years younger, so it was more a like we will look at them together and then I will try to keep him from ruining them with his little tiny baby hands. So yeah, but that, yeah, all of those things, like it's such a specific memory thing that I think is so cool that is specific to comic strips. That is definitely not anything else. And I also I want to go back to the thing you said about how the comics are sometimes superficial, but they don't have to be. Like there is this really cool thing about comic strips where even within the same feature, like you can have a gag strip, like a throwaway strip that is just like a visual joke, or you can have like an ongoing storyline and all of those things, but they're all like, nobody gets confused about whether or not those count as comic strips. And I feel like right now, like online, there's all this discourse of what is and isn't, like what counts as a thing or doesn't count as a thing. And I like that comic strips are so understandable. And that they can be so many things, but you can still like, oh, it's this is what it is. I understand.
Yeah, they're not immune to that kind of confusion, but you're right. I think they've got a certain consistency that other formats and other mediums don't have.
It's also, and I think that part of that is because of the longevity of the format and also generally the longevity of comics as a career. So as you said, you've been doing Frazz for 20 years, which is when people get into comics, I don't know that they're necessarily thinking I'm going to do this for decades. Because I think, I don't know if you thought that you were going to do it for decades, but people do. And that's like, that's normal within this particular job, which is fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, I certainly dreamed of doing it for decades, but every additional day I've gotten to do it has been a surprise and a bonus. Yeah.
So as a person who's been doing a comic, like the same comic for a long time, how do you keep it? I don't even know if you run into this, but I know that sometimes people, like I've had a conversation with a person and I won't say who it is, but they were like, I kind of wish I'd chosen different character designs because I have to do them every day and it's got like, it's just a lot. So like, how do you stay really engaged with this thing that you're doing? Is it easy? Is it hard? Like, do you have advice?
I'm going to paraphrase the cartoonist that you're not naming and say that I got to do it in kind of the opposite way, because I didn't start Frazz as a super young guy. I was just about 40 when I started. I'd had a career. Okay, so I'd started drawing a comic strip when I was in high school. It was an independent study project in a high school class that turned into a job. I mean, I drew a daily comic strip for the local newspaper. It was a small town, Big Rapids, Michigan. Shout out to the Pioneer newspaper. It was a terrific education, but the comic strip characters that I had then were, it was the late 1970s. I was young. It was supposed to be local. I grew up in northern Michigan. It was a French-Canadian trapper, hunter, voyageur, and his Indian guide. And it was 1,000 dumb, stupid, bad, not malicious, but totally wrong stereotypes of Native Americans. And they were also literally and in a more extended way, really superficial. It was just kind of a, George and Gracie, two characters back and forth, any joke will do kind of a format. So that was when I was 18 to 19, something like that. Fast forward to, the turn of the millennium, when I'm working on Frazz, and it comes together. And I've said this so many times, thank God I've got these characters that I developed when I'm older, and not those characters that would not hold up now, and I would be embarrassed trying to prop them up now. So I was fortunate enough to be a lot older, to have a little bit more life under my belt when I made my characters, which is good because those characters kind of drive the writing. I suspect you get that from other cartoonists. I've gotten it from other authors where, you know, I don't know what I'm going to write. The characters haven't told me yet. It's really been fortunate for me to have a good batch of characters. I'll give myself a little bit of credit for that, but a lot of it is just plain luck. And even more, it's that the characters grow. And that's even better, is that I've given myself characters that can grow, and they can tell me not only what the writing is going to be like, but what they're going to be like as time goes by. Most of the characters now don't resemble the way they were when they came into the strip.
I want to go back to a few things that you've said, because I find it really interesting. I think that, first of all, like the talking about the comic that you used to do that you wouldn't do now, and like that acknowledgement. I think that there's a tendency right now to pretend that we've never ever done anything bad in our lives, and everything we've ever done is unimpeachable, and we never like said stuff that was inappropriate or like any of that stuff. So I always find that it's really helpful to say like, hey, this was the past and I did this thing and it wasn't cool then and I didn't know it, and like now I know better and things are different. And it wouldn't happen now, or like you would hope that it wouldn't happen now. So I always find that acknowledgement really refreshing. So I appreciate that. And the other thing is, I'm going to make us both feel old by explaining to the younger people watching this panel, when he says George and Gracie, he means George Burns and Gracie Allen, who were a very famous comedy couple that were married. And George and Gracie were like also obviously very in love, and they had a television show and it was fantastic. And you might think that, like, I don't even know of kids these days who know who George Burns is. But anyway, so that I just wanted to provide some context for people who like,
I
he said a phrase
appreciate
that I didn't know. Well, people I'm short, and I used to have a lot of tall friends, and older people would be like, oh, like a Mutt and Jeff thing. And I was like, what?
Oh,
So,
really?
yeah, like
That's
Mutt and
funny.
Jeff, like short guy, tall guy.
Yeah.
So I think it's also kind of fun to see how just idiomatic phrases change over time, and what the common references are and what they aren't. Like I made a Golden Girls joke to a couple of younger cartoonists, because they were like tall, like cool, and I was like, I'm really the Sophia Petrillo of this group because I'm the oldest, and they were like, we don't know what you're talking about, and I was like, even more the Sophia Petrillo of the group.
That's funny.
So I like, one of the things that I do know about you is you are a man with hobbies. Like you do other stuff that is not cartooning. And I think that's really cool. And I think that a lot of people who are getting into comics are realizing that you have to have other interests. You have to do other things, both for your work and for your health and for yourself. What kind of advice do you have for people who are in cartooning or looking to get into cartooning about like the part that plays in career longevity, and also just like being a person?
Yeah, the big advice is definitely do it. Have a life outside of the cartoon studio. I know the temptation to sit down and crank out the work, because it's a grind. I mean, it's the best grind in the world, but it's 365 short stories per year, ideally year after year after year. That's time consuming. And it's got to be so easy to say, well, it's got to be easy to say, I don't have time for a hobby. Or if you can get beyond that, you can be in my position and say, I feel kind of guilty spending time doing this when I should be doing that. And it's hard. That's, I guess, in a weird way, it sort of adds to the grind. And it doesn't help that a lot of my hobbies have been kind of time consuming and require a certain amount of discipline too. I've fancied myself some kind of an athlete, mostly an endurance athlete. That the training takes a fair amount of time, and you have to do it, if not every day. You have to, consistency matters. But the reward is so so worthwhile. You, especially, maybe I'm giving my own sports too much credit or just too much familiarity. Every run you do, not to mention every race you do or every event you do, is its own lifetime. It has a beginning, it has an end, it has a middle, and it usually has a crisis of some sort that has to be resolved. These things are designed not to go smoothly. And so you learn things about yourself. And those things can be transferred into a story about other difficult things that people do and the crisis they have in the middle of whatever they're doing. Even if it's not a foot race, it's something. And the human reaction to it is going to be similar. And it just makes you feel alive. It keeps you alive. It keeps it from becoming too much of a grind, and it keeps it from becoming too much of a rut. And consistency in training is a good thing, but so is variety in training. Well, consistency in comics is a good thing too. You have to get that strip out there every single day, but variety is also crucial. You can't put the same thing out there every single day. So you've got to have a life. You can't just make stuff up for much more than a year. I don't know, some random number. You can't make stuff up forever, not long enough to sustain a career. You have to steal it from life, not from TV, not even from books. You have to steal it from your own life. And then the next step is you're kind of obligated to go out and have the most interesting life that you can manage while still making up and rendering 365 short stories a year.
I think that's such a fantastic answer. And I can't wait to see like your next story arc of all of the children getting super into like long distance running.
Yeah, it's funny. Maybe they will and maybe they won't, but lessons from the long distance running will certainly play into that. And it's crucial. I could not have done the strip without the running background. I couldn't, unless it was, the strip started out, it was supposed to have more of a musical background. Frazz, his character, the backstory is he's a songwriter, a singer-songwriter that was working as a janitor to make ends meet, and then had hit it big, but still stuck with the job. I thought that gave him some depth as a character, and it also helped to take economic issues out of the picture. Well, how can he afford that? He's a janitor. Well, no, I've got this cheat here that he's maybe loaded, he's maybe just getting by, but he can do things because this isn't his only job. But it was supposed to be, that was his main thing. I had started the strip, it kind of came out of a sequence in my life where my athletic stuff was actually kind of on pause because I had gotten mono, which as an adult, that's a bad thing. It really shuts everything down. And so while I wasn't racing, I got into editorial cartoons, and then from there segued into the comic strip. And finally, once the strip was on its feet, I was able to get back into a little bit of sports, and the sports crept into the comic strip a little bit more. And the response was so good, and it felt so natural to me that I turned Frazz into an athlete as much as a musician. And again, the response was good. So I'm not sure where I started with this, but apparently where I ended up is someplace where the characters grow on their own, whether you've got plans for them or not.
What I will say is that your delivery makes it seem very deliberate. So I just assumed that you definitely knew where you were going with that. And then we all arrived here together. It's perfect.
I am so glad to hear that, because I'm just trying to hang on.
You're doing great. We're all just trying to hang on, man.
That's right.
Oh, that takes me into my next question. So there's
Okay.
been a thing happening.
Oh, has there?
Pandemic. In the old world, when we had friends and got to see them, like, do your friends understand? Like, I know that some cartoonists run into this problem of like people not really understanding what you do and then not really acknowledging it as a real job. Is this a thing that you've run into, or is this like a young person problem?
No, I run into it all the time. It's one of these cases where I get one of two questions and there's nothing in the middle. Either the question is, how do you do it? I have no idea how you do what you do. How do you do it? And the other question is, what do you do all day? And there just doesn't seem to be the question in the middle. Or just, I think by the time anyone gets to know me, they're well aware of the middle. But when people first get to know me and that's their first question, it's one or the other. It's why would anyone relate to this job? It's not very many people have it. So, and even other writers, if they're, a lot of times a writer is a technical writer where they're writing for other people on other people's schedule, or they are writing something that doesn't have quite the same schedule. I think comic strips are pretty unique in that it's a day after day after day thing. Newspaper columnists were pretty close to that. But what's a newspaper columnist? Those were back when George and Gracie were a thing.
You said it. I didn't say it. No one can get mad at me. I didn't make that. Newspapers are doing great. What are you talking about? What is the other interesting thing for me, like the thing about people who are doing comics and doing them entirely themselves, because there are teams of people who will do comics where you have a writer and an artist, but like you do everything yourself. And there's always, again, with like, I'm going to bring up the internet because I can't escape it, but every once in a while, by which I mean every 6 months, there is a big writers versus artists thing in like comic book comics, where writers are like, without us, nothing exists. And artists are like, it's really hard to do art. What are you like? Why are you devaluing our thing? And then it's this big, dumb, non-issue issue that spirals out of control for a little bit. Do you have a favorite? This is not going where you think it's going. You're a comic strip creator, you do all of it yourself, you are a one-man studio. Like, do you have a favorite part of that process, or is there something that's easier or harder? Do you do it all together? Like, how does that work for you? That's
interesting. That's a good question, and I've got either a really good or really lousy answer for you. Obviously it's broken up into parts, but those parts repeat themselves. The process repeats itself so regularly that it's kind of hard to separate it into parts. But it is in different parts. And there are pluses and minuses about each one. My weekly process, first, my weekly process is I will do all 6 dailies.
There's a giant cat behind my computer. I'm very sorry. Like, I'm just trying to keep him from like, no, you're fine.
I don't know if you saw me reaching down, but I was reaching down to pet a cat that wanted onto my lap. And no, we're very cat friendly around here.
There he is. Yes. Yeah, that's a 25-pound cat.
Whew, that's a lot of cat.
That's a lot.
That's impressive.
Let's focus.
Is it an only cat? You got multiple?
I got 4 cats.
4, okay.
Yeah, a normal number of cats.
I've got 3 cats and 1 dog, and did have 4 cats up until fairly recently. So yeah, we are simpatico that way,
We will chat after this chat, but yes, continue to talk about
it. So to answer your question, the process goes with the dailies. I will write all 6 at once, and I will jot them down as if they're teeny tiny little screenplays. Just like little 4-line or 6-line, if I'm too wordy, screenplays. And I will write them out as such. And then I will put one big board up, piece of paper on my board. Here we go. All in one sheet.
Nice.
Like this.
Yeah.
First I will, I'll block out the frames, how many frames does each little screenplay get and what goes in which frame. You got to block out pace out the dialogue. And then after I've done that, the sketching goes in, very light sketching, and then more refined sketching with a darker pencil. The light sketching goes with the non-photo blue pencil. Then in comes the darker pencil that's almost a finished looking version of it. And then I scan that in. So yeah, what I showed you just right here, the next step is this all gets scanned in to the computer. Because for the past, I don't know, 5 years or something, I've been, instead of inking with ink, I've been inking on either a Wacom tablet or an Apple iPad as a tablet, and doing it that way. So I'll ink it digitally and then send it in. So while I'm writing those little screenplays, that's probably the most stressful and the most unpredictable part of the job. And it's in a lot of ways probably the hardest part of the job, which is funny because it looks like the part of the job where I'm wasting time. If you were to walk in on me when I'm writing, it looks like I'm just daydreaming, which I guess I am, just constructively so. And then the next step where you're blocking things out, that looks like it should be easy because, all you're doing is, you've got a ruler and deciding what goes where, but you're deciding what goes where, and everything builds on everything that you're putting down. Then comes the sketches. That takes a little bit of brain power too. And a lot of eraser going on there. Once I get the rough sketches in where everybody's in their place and I get the posture done, I do a lot of gesture drawing, what they call it in art school, where it's really quick scribbles, but a lot of erasing. Well, that scribble didn't work. Do another one, do another one, do another one. And then actually doing the finer stuff with the darker pencil is a little bit easier. And if I'm in such a mood, where I often am, this is where I can put on the headphones and listen to podcasts or audiobooks or something like that. I can't carry on a conversation when I'm doing that. I've tried, but I can listen to some stuff. And that's another good source of input for me. I can, it's not the same as actively going out and running or actively going out and swimming. Or even chatting with real human beings, but it's a form of something going into my head, and that's good. So from there on in, I guess in some ways it looks like it's more work because you're seeing something actually concrete taking place. And in a sense, it also looks like it's less work because I'm just building on what I've done before. But it all runs together over the course of a week that I can't really separate out. I can't separate the process enough to decide what's a favorite part and what's a less favorite part. So that was a long way to go to say, I don't know.
No, that's perfect though, because it's not, if I ask that question and you're like, oh, the writing, and that was it, that would be a terrible experience for the people watching this. But now we've gotten to see your whole process, which is amazing. Yeah, exactly. So I feel like the answers that feel maybe to you in this moment like they are not the most condensed version, that's not a bad thing in something like this, because what people actually want to know is like, hey, what's your process like? But that's kind of like, as far as questions go, I mean, like, I think the list of questions I sent to you ahead of this, I've pointed this out several times because as I am trying to re-engage with the world, I'm thinking about it a lot. Like, how do you get to know people? How do you actually talk to people? I believe one of the questions I had was, what's your deal? And people don't like that question because it's a terrible question, but it's also the question underneath all of the rest of the questions that you ask to figure out who people are. Like, everybody, like, that's what we want to know, right? Like, that's how we're trying to figure it all out. So all of the rest of the questions are just trying to get at that one hilariously blunt question. So back to, I will briefly talk about when the pandemic started. Back in the office, a lot of us were talking about how our cartoonists were talking about wanting to handle strips in the pandemic, because we at the time did not know that it was just gonna like go on forever.
No clue.
So
No clue.
like, how did you decide to handle it, and why did you decide to do it that way?
And it's a work in progress. I try and shift. You have to make some decisions that you're going to stick with, but some of it you can shift with a lot. The big question for me was masks or no masks for the characters. And I still get grief from readers in the comments sections here and there. Why don't you have the characters in masks? Well, they're two-dimensional characters, and they're immune to this thing, and I can appreciate. I try to make the strip as real world as I can, but it's still a comic strip, and facial expressions are important. And I guess I could have made it an interesting challenge for myself, because facial expressions are important, but they're not all important. Body language is important, and I've always tried to make that a vital component of my strip too, of how the characters communicate and interact. So maybe I'd have done well with masks, but that also it locks those characters into a specific time frame, and you're always hoping that people will be reading your stuff 10, 20 years down the road. But it was a big question. It's like, mask or no mask. And of course, when the pandemic first hit, we didn't even know how long we were going to have to mask up. So with even with standard cartoonist deadline time, I'm not one of these guys that's doing strips 2 years in advance. What happens when all the masks come off and your characters are still wearing masks? It's all probably stuff I didn't need to worry about, but I did worry about it. And in the end, it kind of came off, to overuse the phrase, it is what it is. It's just, you just put you just put out there what you can put out there, and let the pandemic take its course. I will use it as subject matter, but usually not directly. Again, there's the issue that things can change so fast. I'm not doing editorial cartoons anymore. I'm doing cartoons about modern life, but not necessarily specifically about modern issues. So I don't want to get that specific, but it is a part of life. And I try and include, if not the actual issue, the way the issue affects how people live. Does that make sense, or does that sound like a dodge?
No, it totally makes sense. And I appreciate that your own light is trying to protect your identity every so often. That's
my computer screen, and I can see when the screen goes to sleep, I can see my face.
And that's when the robot voice kicks in, and it's like, yes, you are in a safe location. So I think the thing that I would say about the way that you're handling the pandemic in Frazz, because we do all kind of look at all the comics in editorial, I appreciate that as a person, like you are a person who's writing for children, and you are trying to do something that acknowledges that things are scary without scaring them. So like, you've created space in a number of storylines where the kids are able to talk about being worried about stuff, and Frazz is able to also tell them that he is also worried about stuff and does not have answers. But like, you have created this, like I said at the beginning of this whole thing, it's a very compassionate way of dealing with characters and situations. And I think that works really well for the current times, because we need it.
And it makes me so happy to hear you say that out loud too, because compassionate that's exactly what I was trying to convey all along. If there's anything at the strip's core, I want it to be compassionate. That's the perfect word. So I'll be smiling all day just because you said that.
So I think we're wrapping up.
Okay.
So is there anything, like, as the last question, the last thing, I have two last things The first
Okay.
thing is there anything we didn't talk about that you really wanted to talk about that you just like want people to know about yourself or your work or comics as a whole or whatever?
Oh, probably, but I can't think of it right now, so we must not have missed anything too bad. Um,
Cool.
Boy, yeah, usually what I try and tell people is get a life and steal from it. And we talked about that right away. Um, be consistent. People will ask, how do you come up with so many ideas? And we'll go back to the sports thing that way too. It's you practice, you just keep doing it. It's not like, a marathon, you have a certain set of miles to go. And when you do 1 mile, you have 1 mile less to go. But if you're a marathoner, there is no finish line. There's just the temporary finish lines, and then you start it over and do it again. And the more miles you run, the more miles you can run. And that's drawing a comic strip. So if anyone's wondering how you do it, that's how you do it. It's a simple answer, but it's the hardest one possible.
I had a second question, but it was basically covered by everything that you just said. Because I was like, well, like, what is advice that you wish you'd gotten, or what is advice that you would give to people, or what encouraging words do you have for people who love comics or want to do comics, or just, like doing their best in a really weird time?
I will. The really weird time. That's a good way to go with it, because what I don't tell a lot of people is that, when I started doing comics as an 18-year-old, even younger than that, and I wanted to do it for a living, one of the reasons that I didn't jump right into it after high school, it wasn't because I knew that my characters were bad back then. It was because I was watching then, and I graduated from high school in 1980, for anyone who wants to spare themselves the math. I didn't think that newspapers were going to be around. This is in 1980. I thought, this is not going well. Comics are not going to be able to be around in this world. And I was wrong. And I'm still wrong. It's 40 years later, and I'm still ridiculously wrong. I'm doing it for a living. Will things stay the same way that they always were? No. Is that a good reason not to draw comics or do anything? No, I don't think it is. There's always a million reasons not to do something, but there only has to be one reason to do it, and that's because you can't not do it. And there you go. Here I am. I still can't not do it, and not just because I'm contractually obligated.
I didn't say that either. I think that that's a fantastic answer. I will also add that I've also had those moments, because I've been doing this for 18 years now. And even in those 18 years, I've had those moments of like, I'm really worried about what's going to happen with newspapers and syndicates and comics and all that stuff. And what I have found in the time that I've been doing this is that stuff will really surprise you, and things pivot in ways that you can't expect. And like, you can't look at the world and think that you know how it's going to go, because you absolutely do not, in the best way.
Exactly. So. Yeah. The characters will do your writing for you, which sounds like it's easy. No, the characters will do your writing for you, and you've got to keep up, which is amazingly hard. But in the same way, the times will do your writing for you too. And all you've got to do is keep up, which is the hardest thing in the world. But that's all you have to do.
Thank you so much for doing this. I think this has been a fantastic talk.
Oh, good. It really has been my pleasure. I've enjoyed this.
That's awesome. I'm really, really glad. So thank you to everybody who's watched this panel for NCS Fest. You can read Frazz at GoComics.com, or you can read Frazz in your newspaper. And if your newspaper doesn't have that comic, you should call your newspaper and tell them to get it.
And you can read Frazz on Facebook. There's a Frazz Facebook page where not only do you get the strip or the link to the strip on GoComics, but every day There's a little bit of a mini blog that's a little bit of the scenes, my scenes, my life behind the comic strip. It's just a little bit of a bonus. And so you can go to that too. That's one more way that you can read Frazz. And please do, and I hope you enjoy it.
No excuses, audience. Go read
Right.
Frazz. So anyway, thank you to the NCS and for GoComics for sponsoring. And I think that's it.
What was that?